My name is Stan Woods. This is the monthly edition of Suds, Snacks, and Socialism. I don't want to explain to everybody what Suds means because everybody here is over 40 with a few exceptions. Yeah, it's on. Suds is an old school name for beer, but like I say, everybody here knows that. This forum is on stopping the war machine. Everybody here is well aware about the fact that there are now four major wars going on the planet, or there's three and a half wars. There's the war in Gaza, the 2-year now proxy war in the Ukraine. Also, we have an increasingly dangerous situation in Syria, where the U.S. finds itself basically backing a former Al-Qaeda affiliate. Talk about gross hypocrisy. And then we have increasing tensions with the People's Republic of China. And we all know where that can lead to. The increasing tensions with the People's Republic of China. And so basically, we have several speakers here tonight who are going to speak about this. First, we have Lisa Eugene. Lisa will be speaking about the increasing tensions with China. And also, she's a representative of the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and also an active member of Peace and Freedom Party. Lisa?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Great. Well, I mean, I look at us as brothers and sisters in the same struggle. And so I want to greet all of you as brothers and sisters here on the left. And also thank my co-presenters who are here, because I think this is a really necessary discussion. When I think about the U.S. war machine, I remember this one Wall Street Journal headline that stopped me a few years ago. And it read, "To deter China, Taiwan must prepare for war." And I cannot forget how this stopped me at that time. This was a few years ago, because it's just at that moment I realized just how little I knew about China. And I was just struggling to figure this headline out, because it just really challenged me with like 3 questions simultaneously. The first question was, why was an American publication so concerned about urgent actions that Taiwan has to take towards China? Another question was, is what they're saying about this war correct? And then another question was, what can I do about any of this? So since then, I think it's been pretty hard for any of us to miss how the US media has increasingly focused on Taiwan and China. And the media rarely mentions that in 1972, the US entered into the Shanghai Communique, where the US formally recognized that Taiwan is a part of China. In recent years, especially since the Obama administration, US officials have labeled China as a threat to Taiwan, pushing US Congress to militarize the island. And we've seen US officials promoting what they call a porcupine strategy. They are flooding or saying that they want to flood Taiwan with weapons to deter a supposed invasion by China, despite long years of no evidence of such plans. US officials openly admit that their real goal is to spark an arms race, which would hopefully turn China into a proxy for the US to destabilize and eventually weaken China. And we've seen that this strategy is becoming clearer when in July 2023, when the Biden administration proposed $345 million in military aid to Taiwan. The US also declared economic war against China by stopping or weakening trade with the country, also weakening and stopping investments in technology relationships. And the US says that these actions are needed for national security reasons, but most of the Chinese companies involved that they're targeting are involved in areas like pharmaceuticals, energy, construction, consumer goods, and transportation, not in the defense industries. Just this month, the US added 140 Chinese companies to its sanctions list, restricting their access to memory chips and chip-making tools. The US government has prevented US firms from investing in Chinese technologies like semiconductors and artificial intelligence. And we're seeing China responding to this. Just 2 days ago, we saw that China has sanctioned 13 US military firms, such as drone manufacturers and other weapons manufacturers that were involved in providing arms to Taiwan. So to better understand US accusations that China is an aggressor, I think it's helpful for us to compare the two countries' military spending within the context of global military spending. Or let's look at the total amount of military spending for all countries around the world. Now, according to the Tricontinental Institute, US military spending in 2022 in total was $1.53 trillion. And that amount includes a lot of money that the US government does not formally acknowledge that it's part of its military budget. And it also, most importantly for us, it represents 54% of global military expenditures, right? If you add in addition to what the US spends alone, if you add in military expenditures and countries the US controls, if we want to understand US accusations about aggression from China towards Taiwan, I think it's helpful for us to compare the two countries' military spending and their footprint in the context of global military spending, or the total amount that they spend militarily and how much of a presence they have around the world. And as I was saying before, according to the Tricontinental Institute, US military spending in 2022, when you include all of their hidden sources that they don't acknowledge, it totaled $1.53 trillion. And so what we're talking about is a country with 4% of the world's population spending 54% of the world's military spending. Right? And that's just the US spending US money. It gets worse, right? If you add in military expenditures by countries the US militarily controls, it calls allies, right? And that includes NATO countries. It also includes US aligned nations like Israel, South Korea, and Japan. All of that military spending together would be over $2 trillion. And that $2 trillion represents 74% of global military spending. That is how much military spending that the United States, with a population of 4% of the world, controls around the globe. All right. In contrast, let's look at China. In this kind of context, China in 2022 spent $292 billion on its military. All right. So check this out. This is a country, over a billion people. Everybody knows that. A country with 18% of the world's population, but they're spending only 10% of global military expenditures around the world. The US spends by itself 54% of global military expenditures. China spends 10%. That's where we're at, all right? If you look at it on a per person basis, the US spends 21 times what China spends on its military per person, all right? That's just the expenditures. Now let's talk about the presence of the US in China militarily around the world. The US also has approximately, what we know of, 900 overseas military bases outside of the United States. All right. And out of these 900 military bases, that includes between 300 to 350 of those bases being put in Asian countries around the border of China. 300 to 300 military bases around the border in other countries around the border of just one country. All right. China has 8 foreign military bases, 8 bases outside of its own country. All right. And this reflects what the U.S. has called, if we recall, former National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, this reflects what they call a policy of encirclement. All right. And they said, Condoleezza Rice explained overtly that this is a strategy that's aimed at shifting power in East Asia from amongst those countries and primarily China to the United States. All right. And so we also see that there are big U.S. expenditures to contain China up to this day. It's still ongoing. In December 2021, despite or in the face of 1 million U.S. deaths from COVID, Biden signed a $768 billion defense bill explicitly focused on China's containment. He was diverting funds from essential domestic needs that we have, like food and education, towards military expansion in and around the Pacific. And so all of these facts, and what I hope to share with you, that these facts make it clear that U.S. militarism is what poses the greatest domestic and global threat to us and the world. It's not China's internal affairs with one of its own territories known as Taiwan. So that's the current conditions that we're observing in the press, in the history. And the question from that is, why is the U.S. so focused on economic and military aggression? Why is it? And so we have to remember that the U.S. ruling class has a long-held strategy to preserve its global dominance since World War II, and they use a 2-pronged strategy. The first prong is to weaken or contain all enemies. The second prong is to keep all of its allies dependent on them and to prevent any allies from becoming rivals or being able to join up with any adversaries. And so with that framework, we can think back to 2012, and that's when U.S. officials basically started saying out loud that they realized that China would never voluntarily allow itself to become subservient to the U.S. And that's when you started to see Obama administration officials talking about a pivot to Asia. Hillary Clinton gave famous speeches with this phrase, a pivot to Asia, which essentially is a pivot towards containing China. Fast forward to 2020, and we start to see that forecasts appear in 2020 that show that China's gross domestic product would surpass the US by 2028, just a couple of years from now. And since those forecasts from 2019 to 2023, we've received documentation that China's economy has grown more than double the US's economy. And so this has really alarmed U.S. ruling elites, and they've begun labeling China as the U.S.'s top strategic threat. And so what we saw starting in 2022 is both neoconservatives and liberals start calling for simultaneous wars with China and Russia, right? And so another question is, how do we think about progressive working people like ourselves who do not see the Democrat warmongering around China as being as dangerous as it is? And so I think about 2 comparisons, and one of them is that back in 1989, there's somebody that we on the left know, Michael Parenti, wrote this book called The Sword and the Dollar, and he talks about how in that time, there was a perception that the Democrats or the liberals, they were softer on militarism. They were softer on war. And this was a widely held perception, even though there's a long track record of Democratic presidents getting us into wars. And at the time, people had a widely held perception, because they were so overt about it, that the Republicans were just the ones that were harder, that they were the ones that were the more overt, jingoistic, the more overtly aggressive about military action everywhere. But today, 35 years later, that just doesn't hold up anymore. Right? We're seeing that Democrats no longer even pretend to be doves. They no longer pretend to be pacifists in any way, especially regarding China. They are just as capable of managing the war machine and provoking China on the world stage. And I just want us to remember back in August 2022, when the entire US public was subjected to the spectacle of Nancy Pelosi getting on a plane to fly to Taiwan just to openly provoke the Chinese government and create a media spectacle. Nancy Pelosi is not Trump. She's not a right-wing leader. She's a Democrat. And so is Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, or Jake Sullivan. But all of these Democrat leaders are aggressively confronting China and promoting anti-China militarism. And so just to conclude, the question is, what should we do about this situation? In my opinion, we're going to have to help working people to see that the great many of them who already support policies that we are for, policies like free healthcare, education, abortion rights, that they are being pushed into dangerous militarism that really risks global catastrophe for all of us. Today's Democrats, we're going to have to help them to see that today's Democrats have made criticizing US imperialism impossible within the establishment. It's just not possible anymore to hold that point of view and be within the establishment parties. We are going to have to help them to learn to demand the closure of these 900 overseas military bases, or to redirect the funding for $1.5 trillion back to us, towards our housing, our schools, and our healthcare. All right. And to see and be clear that Democrats are spreading lies about China and framing war as necessary just to enrich themselves, basically, and to enrich the ruling class. The ray of hope that we have, and I'm almost done, Connor, is that the working class, we have a ray of hope in the last election, that the working class might be starting to see through this charade that maybe has been posed by the Democrats. And that is, in the last election, we learned that 13 million people who voted for Biden in 2020 did not show up for Kamala Harris, right? And so we're seeing widespread, and what we think is a signal of widespread disillusionment. And fortunately for us, and for why we're here, an openness to alternatives amongst the voters. And so many working people already know inside themselves that the answer for these types of issues is a militant demand for peace. And we're going to have to show them that it's possible to organize outside the Democrats to shut down the war machine. A peace movement needs a peace-focused party. We need a party where the working class can learn that it can organize and it can fight against capitalism. And we can do all of that by building socialist power right here in California through the Peace and Freedom Party. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.